In order to be a role model in timekeeping, I will start by introducing our first speaker, NORDIN, SHACHAR. As usual, we take a huge leap back in history and try to add some interesting aspects and perspectives to today's topic. NORDIN, it's a pleasure to have you here. The floor is yours.
A few days before Christmas in 1632, stunning rumors reached the court in Madrid. There was bad news, for the Catholics had lost yet another battle to the Swedes, near the town of Lützen. But along with the bad news, there was some good news too, news too good to be true. The Swedish king, Gustav Adolf II, Gustavo Adolfo to the Spaniards, was said to have fallen in battle. Thanks to his charisma and military genius, Swedish forces now held large areas in Bavaria, deep inside the Holy Roman Empire, also known as the Habsburg Empire. The Habsburgs ruled both from Vienna and from Madrid, and they controlled half of Europe and much of America. News traveled slowly. It was more than a month since the Battle of Lützen and the death of the king. But the Count of Olivares, here is the Count of Olivares, who was the power behind the scenes in Habsburg Madrid, he wouldn't allow any rejoicing until his ambassador in Brussels, another important Spanish city, had confirmed the sensation. When proof arrived that the Lion of the North, as the Swedish king was known in Spain, that he was really gone, the church bells of Madrid began to chime. Thanksgiving was held, and all night the winter skies were illuminated by fireworks. Fireworks then being much more expensive than now. And the great Spanish poets Lope de Vega and Francisco de Quevedo wrote sonnets about the death of the king. Both of them likened Gustav Adolf to a ray of lightning, rapid and destructive, as his armies had been. Quevedo wrote in a letter about Gustav Adolf, his memory will be glorious, but not good, since his aims were not righteous. He lost his soul as the heretic that he was. So there was passion in the Spanish reaction, just as there was dark passion in the Swedish view of Spain. The countries hated each other. Why? In those days, enemies usually shared a common border, or at least a common sea. But Sweden and Spain were enormously distant from each other. But they were the ideological poles in a religious war, which is almost a word war. When the king died at Lützen, bad blood between the countries had been brewing for more than a century. Ever since the Swedes broke away from the Union of Kalmar. The Kalmar Union was a Scandinavian alliance between equals. It was a brilliant idea, but by the mid-15th century it had become a system for Danish dominance. Danish kings treated Sweden and Norway as vassals, and they did it with the open support from the Habsburg emperors in Vienna. In 1506, the Emperor Maximilian declared the entire Swedish leadership outlaws, bandits who could be killed on sight for their disobedience to the Danes. In 1520, the Danes reached Stockholm and murdered most of the Swedish elite in the infamous bloodbath of Stockholm. They left the dead unburied in the streets to the dogs and the ravens. Behind the massacre was the Danish king, Christian II, forever after called Christian the Tyrant by Swedes. He was the brother-in-law of the Holy Roman Empire, Karl of Habsburg, who was also the Spanish king Carlos V, the Fifth, as he's called in Spain. The emperor did not approve of the massacre in Stockholm, but he supported Danish rule in Sweden. The bloodbath left a trauma in Sweden and spurred a revolt a few years later when Sweden broke away from the Danes and also broke away from the Pope and the Roman Church. the national liberator of Sweden, King Gustav Vasa, lost both his parents to the Danish terror. And the way the Swedes saw it, the Pope and the Emperor were the enablers of the bloodbath. The Spanish king, Carlos, wasn't just any king. He was the head of the supreme great power of the day. He was the ruler of most of Germany, southern Italy, the Netherlands, the West Indies, Mexico, and soon also of Peru. For a century and a half, from the conquest of Granada in 1592 until the Battle of Rocroi in 1643, the Spanish infantry, the tercios, would never lose a land battle. But even as Carlos ruled half the world, he took a keen interest in Sweden and dreamt of bringing it back to Catholicism. In 1542, when a peasant rebellion broke out in Sweden, Dackefejden, the emperor supported it and tried to put one of his minions on the Swedish throne. Sweden then was an insignificant country. When the 30-Year War broke out in 1618, Sweden was not involved. The war went well for the German Catholics, but then in 1630, Gustav Adolf, he entered the war. He was a religious zealot and a great strategist. His new methods soon tipped the balance in the war. In less than a year, the Swedes and their allies had driven a wedge deep into the emperor's lands. Soon before he died, Gustav Adolf made a triumphant entry into Munich, one of the principal imperial cities. And there was now great anxiety in Vienna and Madrid. Some Spanish planners suggested a plot to poison the Swedish king, but Olivares, the Spanish strongman, refused it as an unworthy act. After Lützen, without the king, Sweden did worse. In the Battle of Nördlingen in 1634, the only direct confrontation ever between Spain and Sweden, the Swedish forces were crushed and their commander-in-chief was taken prisoner. But the defeat brought Sweden more luck. It worried Catholic France so much that she entered the war on the Swedish side. At the peace talks in Westphalia, which ended the 30-Year War, Sweden became a new European power, while the Spanish superpower began its long decline. But a few years later, the Spaniards scored a spectacular moral blow against Sweden when Queen Christina abdicated and went to live in the Spanish city of Antwerp and became a Catholic. That shamed Sweden. Imagine the daughter of Gustav Adolf, the Protestant holy warrior, turned her back on the true faith and her country and joined the enemy camp. So there was no love lost between the countries. Gustav Adolf even had plans to help Portugal break away from Spain and gain independence. 1580 to 1640, Portugal was part of Spain. And Spain was then the largest empire ever in history, larger even than the Soviet Union was to become. Sweden wanted Portugal free because Sweden needed Portuguese salt. Salted fish and pork was the Swedish winter food, and they didn't want to rely on the Spaniards and Spanish goodwill to get the salt. At the other extreme of the map, the Spaniards had serious plans to conquer the fortress of Älvsborg, which was Sweden's only Atlantic port at that time, but nothing came of it. So the Spanish-Swedish story was dramatic and bloody and soaked in religious fanaticism. But the enmity was balanced by other factors which forced them to collaborate. One such factor is only an hour's drive from here, at the copper mine at Falun. Soon after the conquest of Peru, the Spaniards heard rumors of a mountain made of pure silver. That was almost true, and in a few years, a city grew around Potosi, with the silver mountain in the background. It's the highest city in the world, 4,000 meters high. So from 1550, once a year, a huge silver convoy, almost 100 ships, protected by many more warships, protected against British and Dutch pirates, went from Cartagena in Colombia to Seville in Spain. That sounds like any country's dream, but the Spaniards didn't understand markets, and it became a nightmare. By flooding their economy with silver, they debased their currency and caused wild inflation at home. In order to fix this, the Spaniards abandoned the silver standard in 1599 and began to coin copper money. And for Falun, the sudden and sustained demand from the world's richest nation was one of the most powerful impulses ever on Sweden's economic life. The copper mine in Falun soon became the biggest work site in the country, and for decades, 2/3 of global copper production came from Falun. There was another factor which tempered the natural hostility between Sweden and Spain, a factor even more fabulous, because both nations, Sweden and Spain, had very similar myths of origin, glorious but false myths. Both imagined that they hailed from an extinct warrior nation, the Goths. According to the myth, the Goths were pushed back to this green strip of territory in the north, in Asturias and the Basque lands, and in a famous battle, perhaps a mythical battle, the Battle of Covadonga, the Goths held the line and blocked the Muslims from entering Europe. And according to the Spanish foundation myth, this northern holdout of fighting Goths was the embryo of the Spanish nation and the starting point of the long Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of Muslim lands. So until the 1960s, many leading Spanish historians, not just fascists and mystics, saw Spain and Spaniards as the reborn Gothic nations. Sweden also had its own Gothic myth of origin. And the Swedes knew about the Spanish Gothic myth, and the Swedes sent explorers to Spain to look for runes, for old inscriptions in the rune language. I was going to tell you about what Gustav III, told Francisco de Miranda, the great Spanish liberal from Venezuela. But since my time is up, I'll tell you all privately if you...
I have to be a little harsh on the timekeeping, but Sweden and the legacy of Luther. Svante, yes. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, the Reformation, the Lutheran Reformation, was the second most important event in Swedish history. The most important event in Swedish history, of course, was the coming of Christianity. That made us Europeans and made Sweden part of Western civilization, to a certain extent at least. But the Reformation, the Lutheran Reformation, was also defined what Sweden is and what it is to be Swedish. Gustav Vasa, mentioned by Nathan, was the king who went through the movements of making Sweden a Lutheran country. And this fellow, Gustav Vasa, of course, is one of the key persons in Swedish history. In a way, he created Sweden. He broke us with Denmark. He made Sweden a national kingdom, apart from the union with Denmark and Norway. So, with Gustav Vasa, Sweden becomes a national state. And that, of course, defines what it is to be a Swede, and what Sweden is. But at the same time, Reformation also made a break with room with the Catholicism and made Sweden into a northern and western European countries. There are two really important divides in Europe, of course. One is the east-west, and the other is the north-south divide. And Sweden, of course, belongs to the west of Europe and to the north of Europe. And that's because Sweden is Lutheran, a Protestant country. So this lines tells us what Sweden is. Now, Gustavus Vasa, he made this reformation. There was a lot of resistance, not to mention Dackefejden and so on and so forth. And in fact, Gustavus Vasa left to his 3 sons to fight it out. They were Erik, Johan, and Charles. And Johan was a dubious fellow. He had Catholic tendencies. To a certain. Yes, he married a Polish princess, and he got a son, Sigismund, who was wholly Catholic. So Charles had to intervene to save Sweden from the Roman Catholic era, so he made a rebellion, and Sigismund was disposed of. And this required another bloodbath, the second great bloodbath in Swedish history, the Linköping bloodbath, where Charles cut the heads of those who thought too well of Catholicism. And then the Swedish church had a meeting, the so-called Uppsala möte, at the end of that century, around 1600. And this Uppsala meeting was very, very important. It defined what Lutheranism should be in Sweden. There existed the Augsburgian confession, but Charles added a few points of his own to this the decision of this Uppsala meeting. And in fact, to the extent that God keeps to the decision of Uppsala meeting, we cannot be wholly certain of that, but probably if God keeps to the decision of Uppsala meeting, if you come to heaven, some of you might, you will hear a lot of Swedish spoken. Most people there will be Swedes. A few Finns, but most of them Swedes, according to Uppsala möte's decision. So now Sweden was really Lutheran for several centuries. And not to be a good Lutheran was to be a bad Swede. So the nationality and the religious faith and confession were very much the same thing. And then, of course, Gustavus Adolphus, which we have also heard about. And he saw that, he realized that Protestantism in Sweden was threatened by the Kaiser, by the emperor, the German emperor, whose armies came closer and closer to Sweden. And they had this fellow Wallenstein, who was a very good general, and they came closer and closer. So Gustavus Adolphus intervened. He not only saved Lutheranism in Sweden, but in Germany as well. So he was really a hero. For centuries, many Germans were very strong supporters of Gustavus Adolphus. So again, Sweden's rule as a great power was very much interconnected with the Lutheran faith and the Lutheran confession. You couldn't think of Sweden without thinking of Luther and this church. Of course, another point, another very important thing is that a Roman Catholic country is a divided country. There is a king or some prince, and then there is the Pope. And sometimes the king says one thing, and then suddenly the Pope says another thing. So that's trouble, really trouble. Gustavus Vasa made an end to that. He became the head of the Swedish church. So the king, the secular ruler, and the head of the church was one and the same person. So that's unity. It's the Swedes. There were no divided opinion at all, and that was what Uppsala Mötes said. From now, we have only one faith in Sweden. We all speak with the same voice. We are a unity. So that's very important. That went on for, well, perhaps even today. A certain legacy, at least, of that national unity. And if you try to think otherwise, or had another confession, another faith, well, you couldn't do that. You had to leave Sweden, or have your heads cut off, which occurred to some Catholics. And as Nathan mentioned, this catastrophe, this scandal, when the queen, the daughter of Gustavus Adolphus, became a Catholic. And of course, some Jesuits, some Spanish Jesuits, went secretly to Stockholm to have conversations with the Queen Christina. And she thought the Lutherans boring. Catholicism was much more intellectually stimulating to her. So she went to Rome and all that. And of course, the Swedes were very, very, very angry. They were not very happy. So Charles XI and Charles XII were really Protestant kings and really Lutheran kings. So in fact, the legacy of Luther was consolidated in Sweden for several centuries. Not until, well, the late 19th century and the early 20th century, it became possible to doubt some of the dogmas of the Lutheran confession. But at the same time, I believe that the Roman Catholic remained enemies in a way. If you look at the debate in Sweden in the second half of the 20th century about the European Union, you will see that to the Social Democrats and even to some liberals and conservatives, the very fact that the European Union was founded by Catholics, some of them very confessing Catholics, really was a good reason why Sweden could not join the European Union. That would be to join the Catholics. I think that it sounds a bit ridiculous, perhaps, but I think that was a really important factor at that time. So that's one legacy that this Protestant northern community, the Danes, the North Germans, the British, the Scots, the Americans were much more acceptable than the French or the Italians. And you know, Frenchmen and Italians really, if you think of it, you will realize that you can't trust them. It's impossible. They do, for one thing, Catholics do not take sex seriously. Not really. They have all kinds of scandals. We had a Frenchman here connected to the Swedish Academy. We had to lock him up. He didn't behave. So, in a way, it's still with us. We have forgotten the Augsburgian Confession, but we still have many of the stock responses, the stock reactions against the Catholics. Think of the question of abortion, for example. You could discuss the right of abortion in several ways, but in Sweden you cannot discuss it. It's not arguments on both sides. It's just treason to question the right of abortion, and I think that's also part of this Protestant legacy, that some of the things that Catholics stand for is so really so evil, in a way evil. It's not opinion. It's alliance with the devil, and we still have some of that animosity left even today.
Has this influenced our view on Muslims, that we sort of say we should actually be Protestants in Sweden? As a consequence, we don't accept Catholics, and as a consequence, we are suspicious of other religions, including Muslims.
Are we? I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not certain it's the same thing.
It's not.
My point is that centuries of hatred against the Roman Catholic has left us a legacy.
Yes.
And we had nothing to do at all with Muslims in my childhood. Nobody had ever heard talk.
But am I arguing that a very strong Protestant identity makes you suspicious of any other religion? Yes,
I don't think so. No.
Okay, thank you. Time saved. Anna from Bayern. Anna from Bayern, welcome, and I very much like your title, The Problems with Bullerbyn Perspectives from Germany on Sweden's Changing Image. I'm very excited.
Büt, Kinder, büt, morgen kommt der Schwed, morgen kommt der Ochsenstern, wird den Kindern beten lernen. Büt, Kinder, büt, morgen kommt der Schwed, morgen kommt der Ochsenstern, wird den Kindern beten lernen. Bet, Kinder, bet.
Bet, Kinder, bet, morgen kommt der Schwed, morgen kommt der Ochsenstern, wird den Kindern beten lernen. Pray, little child, pray, because tomorrow the Oxenstierner will come and he will teach you how to pray. So this is my son coming home singing on a lullaby, basically. Of course, referring to, Nathan, what you already spoke about, the 30-year war and the fear of the Swede at the time that was so incredible and Sweden so ominous that it actually translates into a song that a child sings on 400 years later. Of course, obviously, completely oblivious what it was about. But fear, I would say, today is no longer Sweden's image problem in Germany. It's really the profile issue is more a lack of profile. And the reason is that Sweden has not owned its profile or its narrative on the international scene effectively. For example, in the reporting around the UN or Davos, WEF, it doesn't really figure. And this comes at two false cost, of course. First, the strength of Sweden and what it stands for don't translate. Nobody knows about it. Across Germany goes largely unnoticed, for example, science, entrepreneurship, etc. And the second is that this narrative vacuum, so to speak, is filled with journalists using Sweden for their own agenda setting, perpetuating this idea of Bullerbyn, Astrid Lindgren's idyll, using Sweden as a projection, really, as a surface of projection and warping the image. I will give a little bit of a historical context of this and will establish that the bias of mostly left-leaning media has really largely kept this idea of Bullerbyn alive, even as negative news are increasing. And will conclude that Sweden's lack of ownership of its storytelling really carries risk, especially in times of need. And those times of need have come because the trend is now negative, clearly, and with very direct negative consequences as well. But just looking at shared Swedish-German roots, so Sweden and Germany have already been close. We've heard a little bit about it. Actually, going back to 500 BC, you can see it here, shared roots, and you can, of course, also hear it in the language, right? 100, 100, und so weiter. It's very audible still. Germany has historically been Sweden's most important trading partner, dating back to the Hande, and in the time of Gustav Vasa, of course, in Reformation, important economic, political, cultural impulses were imported by Germans. And of course, a significant part of Sweden's population spoke Germany. Throughout time, really, German was also the first language taught in Sweden's school until, incidentally, the end of World War II, when priorities shifted very subtly to English, but those generations all spoke German. Starting with Ludwig the German in 1843, Sweden has had many kings and queens, of course, from the continent, East Franconia, German, Roman, Habsburg empires, Christoph of Bavaria, of course, the famous King Carl Gustav the 10th, the 11th, famous Karl XII, were from the Wittelsbach family that ruled Bavaria, and Pfalz-Zweibrücken. And countless kings, of course, have married Germans. To this day, the mother of the current king was German, his wife as well. And military ties were, of course, also always close. And in fact, there was exchange with generals and military from Sweden training the Prussian army, for example. And the term Alter Schwede, Old Swede in Germany, is still a term of respect. These old ties and affinity, of course, also and cultural exchange. Augustin Beck went to Berlin. He found his second wife there. Hjalmar Bergman drank himself to death there. I mean, there was a lot of exchange. These ties, of course, permeated in World War II. As you know, many in Sweden were on the German side in World War I, especially in military circles. And in World War II, Swedish neutrality really meant, in the words of Winston Churchill, that Sweden ignored the greater moral issues and played both sides for profit. Of course, the war was great business, and the German war effort relied on Swedish iron ore, and communist Russia was widely considered the bigger threats. And of course, there was also the personal ties of Hermann Göring living in Sweden between the wars and marrying a Swede that Hitler is said to have been very fond of as well. But very importantly is from this context is just that Sweden sort of after the war remained one of the few friendly neighbors, if not the only that Germany had. So there was still, it was a natural haven for people from war-stricken Germany, and contemporaries marveled at the wealth, the idea of Folkhemmet, where everybody would be cared for according to need, and of course the ideal of the equality between the sexes, and education and healthcare system were sort of seen as the path to socialist utopia in Germany. And as socialist countries failed, and you could see East Germany failing and communism really losing its appeal in line with the atrocities committed in its name, Sweden served as sort of proof that the concept was alive and doing well and was really viable. The ensuing media bias really persists to this day in Germany, and is probably the main reason why the idea of Bullable might have become fractured, but is far from shattered. So the image of Sweden in Germany is still positive, but on a very sort of low level, because the knowledge about Sweden is very limited. According to the Swedish Institute, the level of knowledge about Sweden is relatively low anywhere apart from in the neighboring Nordic countries. And the German Media Tenor Institute analyzed that news coverage about Sweden in opinion-leading German media and international TV news between sort of in the last 15 years. And they say Sweden is simply below the awareness threshold in German TV news, for example. Their analysis is that that reporting about current affairs in Sweden is just seen as sort of little public use in Germany, except when it comes to international sporting events, which is by far the category that's most reported on with regards to Sweden, and of course, the Nobel Prize. Now, what German journalists do consider valuable is to report selectively on Sweden for the purpose of their own agenda setting. In Sweden, as well as in Germany, media representatives are often left-leaning. There's surveys on this, of course, that about half either sympathize with Green, Socialist, or Left Party. And for example, the Green Party is largely overrepresented. 27% they said they voted Green, whilst in the general public, the Greens only get about 15%. And I think only 10% or 12% identified with conservative or liberal parties. So news from Sweden seem to be filtered and selected to support left causes. For example, when it comes to the labor market, it's not about general trends, but a disproportionate focus on gender issues. The situation of women is the main area of interest, and the reporting is overwhelmingly positive, as is the case on the employment of minorities. Sweden is also often referenced as an example of the positive effects of high taxation, and of course the welfare state overall is regularly praised. And there's also focus on the general asylum policy, which is portrayed in positive tone, and Sweden as a place of longing. The topic of immigration actually is interesting because as you can see here, German media is much more positive on Sweden than media in the UK or US. And one reason, I think, is that immigration is viewed more critically in UK and US. So a lot of this negative news is on immigration, whereas in Germany, when there's talk about immigration in Sweden, that's usually presented in a positive tone and as sort of the ideal of free immigration and integration actually working. Now, again, these trends have changed in the past few years, but overall, that's been the case. Nowhere, though, is the use of Sweden for domestic agenda setting more obvious than in the reporting on Greta Thunberg. She's by far the most referenced Swedish protagonist. She was featured 8 times more than Magdalena Andersson, as you can see, or Anders Tegnell or the King, and overwhelmingly positive, neutral to positive. This was also the time when Greta became sort of the face for the Fridays for Future movement in Germany, which in turn really helped the dynamic of the Green Party that, of course, went on to success, historic success actually for them in the election. So it's interesting because Sweden, when you ask the public, Sweden is not seen as visionary on sustainability or environmental issues. It's really completely reduced to Greta. The media bias in the reporting is exacerbated by the one in Sweden, of course. Foreign correspondents source their stories in local media, so they unwittingly import the same blind spots and the self-censorship of the Swedish media. So while Sweden is used for agenda setting, it really fails to strategically and actively raise and shape its profile internationally. The UN framework, for example, is a framework where it's pretty easy for small countries to appear and become visible in the debate. But as you can see here, there's plenty of other, small countries that play a role, but Sweden doesn't really. There's also, when you see the global business context, with the World Economic Forum, for example, also a great stage where Sweden could play a role and be strategic in its communication. But there is no reflection whatsoever, for example, on Sweden outperforming other EU countries as an innovation leader, or one of the most innovative economies in the world, the very vibrant startup scene. The news on Swedish companies is still in Germany centered around H&M, IKEA, very much old economy. So Sweden seems to behave a little bit like a family business in the past when it comes to communication. So any day without bad news is kind of a good day. And instead of being proactive, very content with a little visibility, which of course works well in good times, but it really costly to not having sort of paid into your reputation account and having established your strength and your relevance in times of need. And of course, detrimental is also that some negative news from Sweden have become too obvious to ignore. The tale of the open heart, a successful open heart policy on immigration has crumbled. Crime statistics and bombings in Sweden don't get much coverage in Germany. I'm always surprised how little, but they do get reported. And also things like Sweden having cheated so extensively on the PISA studies. The Germans have taken these PISA studies very, very seriously, and they've always looked at Sweden and said, it's amazing how well they're doing, and look at them, they don't give their kids grade, and everybody's included, and they're doing tremendously well. And this was hailed in all the socialist-led federal states, which incidentally also doing terrible in school. But of course, then it turned out Sweden had eliminated the lowest 15% of schools from this test, and that also eliminated the lowest in the worst schools that they accepted in the study, which were, of course, okay, they're not the lowest. They also took out the students in the schools that would feel frustrated or depressed by participating in the test, which were the worst performing students. I'm not joking, this is actually what happened. So anyway, this was also a report. So it's sort of catching up that maybe not everything is going as well, and the picture is not as picture perfect. And with negative news increasing, the positive image of Sweden in Germany is in decline. And financial analysts are even more negative. While journalists report on the country's outlook is relatively neutral, analysts are much more pessimistic than on Sweden, and are much more pessimistic on Sweden and rate Sweden worse than Norway, Finland, or the Netherlands. But have these news really shattered the idea of, or the German idea of Bullerby? I would say not yet, because there's just a lack of interest, because Sweden is less relevant to Germany than many other closer or bigger European neighbors. And there's, of course, also a reluctance to draw the uncomfortable conclusions that come with such news, because Bullerby as a concept still holds enormous appeal, and it's tough to let go of utopia, and there's really no reason why the Germans should be any better at it. But the trend is clearly negative as recent news start to puncture an ideal that was fraught and unrealistic to begin with. And Sweden really needs to begin owning its story, driving a more realistic narrative in order to provide proof of its relevance as a player in Europe. Without such strategic communication, the cost can really be tremendous. And I think we've seen it recently. There's little to no public solidarity in Europe in times of need. Or did you hear any outcry at Turkey blocking Sweden joining NATO? Because in Germany, I didn't hear it. Thank you very much.